When you hear Titanic 2027, your first reaction is probably doubt. But this project hides choices that almost never make the headlines. What was kept, what was changed, and what was built so you would recognize it instantly. Today, you are about to discover 20 little-known facts, and the last one completely changes the way this ship is seen. Like the video and subscribe to the channel, because now we are diving into the details that surprise people the most and divide opinions the most. These facts are not guesswork. They show up when you cross-check announcements, interviews, and technical details that usually stay out of the spotlight. The first one is simple, but it changes everything. A project this heavy almost never starts from nothing. Before it becomes a social media headline, it usually exists for years in sketches, meetings, models, and quiet negotiations. And the longer it stays behind the scenes, the more decisions pile up. Some driven by engineering, others by public image. So here is the question: what was planned to be seen and what was planned to go unnoticed? That is exactly where the interesting details start to surface. Look at a choice that seems obvious but is actually explosive: keeping the name Titanic. A lot of people criticize it because the name carries a heavy memory and a debate that never stays neutral. But from the project's point of view, the name is a magnet. It creates instant recognition and instant conversation. And when a project also lives on attention, conversation becomes fuel, even when that conversation is criticism. The fact here is that the name is not just a label, it is strategy and risk at the same time, and that changes how everything is presented, from design to communication. If the name already splits people, imagine what happens when you get into the details. Here comes the first big expectation break. The project is not designed to be a perfect copy of 1912. That is not a lack of care. That is modern engineering, operations, and regulation. A ship can look historic and still be radically different inside because today the structure has to meet a completely different safety and circulation standard. And that look is intentional. It is what makes the public recognize it in seconds before they even understand what they are looking at. So the real fact is this gap between aesthetics and structure. Are you looking at a tribute or a modern ship wearing classic clothes? That question keeps showing up in this topic. The exterior is designed to hit your eyes fast. Classic lines, familiar proportions, and that visual signature the brain recognizes without effort. 4 funnels. It is almost a mental shortcut. But that familiarity is a tool, not just decoration. It creates the feeling of, I know this, even if almost everything has been rebuilt and recalculated. And a lot of the time, that is exactly what the project wants: immediate recognition before any explanation. The interesting part is that the ship's face serves a very practical purpose. It opens the door to the experience, but once you step inside, the logic changes and it gets much more technical. Inside, the ship has to obey a world of rules that did not exist in 1912. Exits, doors, compartmentation, accessibility, evacuation routes, materials. Those things decide whether a ship can operate or not. So the interior becomes a puzzle. Keep the historic look without compromising modern safety. Many of those changes are integrated so well you do not even notice them. And that is intentional. The fact is that the period feeling can be preserved while the real structure is completely different and invisible. The public sees wood and polished metal. Behind that, there is an engineering system built around flow and protection. And when you look closer, details start showing up that are not in the usual talking points. When a project really wants to convince people, it does not just copy what is famous. It goes after what is rare, less published blueprints, hard-to-find photos, inventories, finished patterns almost nobody knows. That creates a kind of realism that is not movie magic. It is research applied to design, and that is where small choices start changing the whole result. Curves, cut lines, textures, hardware, proportions. The fact here is that those rare details are often what makes people feel like this looks real, even if they cannot explain why. But not every detail survives the test of the present, and that is where the hard part begins. What has to be left behind? A project with this name cannot look like it is pushing the limit. It tends to place safety above the minimum required because it knows everyone will compare it to 1912, even if that comparison is unfair. You see it in redundancy, locks, repeated inspections, and procedures that may look excessive but are not. And this is not just about following the rules, it is about reducing room for public interpretation. Because here, the conversation is not only technical, it is reputational. The interesting part is that, on a ship like this, safety becomes part of the official narrative, even when it stays hidden behind the aesthetics. And that sets the stage for the technology piece. In navigation, there is no room for nostalgia. Modern systems fully replace any old method with redundancy and precision that are not up for debate. That changes the work routine too. Data reading, cross-checks, alerts, status confirmations. At the same time, the project tries to preserve the historic look without turning into a theme park, so part of that technology is integrated, disguised, almost invisible inside the design. The fact is that the public often thinks they are looking at the past, while they are completely surrounded by the present. And then an uncomfortable question shows up. How far can something look old without confusing what is real? That tension is part of the whole subject. Here is something else most people never think about. A modern ship is monitored all the time, not just en route, but in operations, maintenance, critical sensors, power, stability, and system integrity. That creates an invisible layer of control the public never sees, but it defines the project day to day. The fact is that this layer is one of the biggest differences between a beautiful replica and a ship that can actually operate. And for the people working on it, that is what prevents surprises. But there is a side effect. The more the present imposes itself, the more impossible the idea of exactly like the original becomes. And that leads to the turning point. Here is the point that changes the whole game. A ship with the original characteristics, exactly as it was, simply would not sail today. Rules, requirements, and safety culture have changed what is acceptable at sea. So when someone says, perfect replica, be careful, because in practice the project has to be something else on the inside. This fact is not only technical, it changes the meaning of the project. It is not rebuilding the past, it is reinterpreting it within modern limits. And that explains why this topic is so fascinating. It mixes tribute with the real responsibility of operation. If you want to get to the most controversial part, the one that splits experts and the public, like and subscribe, because now the conversation moves into symbolic weight and ethical decisions. Now we get into something almost nobody discusses calmly. This is not only engineering, it is public perception. When a project carries a name this heavy, every detail becomes a judgment, even the details nobody sees. That is why many decisions are made in layers: what gets shown, what gets integrated, and what stays invisible. And the fact is that managing perception becomes part of the project itself, almost like a parallel system running beside construction. Have you noticed how some choices feel a little too neutral? That is usually intentional, to avoid triggers and easy interpretations. The real question is this: can you build a historical experience without turning it into exploitation? This is where the narrative starts carrying as much weight as the steel. The next fact shows up in the curation process behind the scenes. How do you present the past without turning everything into spectacle? In projects like this, there is always concern about creating period spaces, but with modern controls hidden behind them, from the way areas are organized to how people are guided through them. That affects flow, lighting, discrete barriers, and what can or cannot be accessible. And the interesting part is this: the more natural the experience feels, the more work is happening behind the scenes to keep everything under control. Nothing is left to chance. This is not just about polish. It is a way to keep the project from being seen as shock entertainment. And that concern leads directly into the core debate. This is the hottest center of the conversation, the debate over how far the past should be recreated. Some people see tribute, some people see provocation, and that turns into very concrete choices. What gets shown, what gets hidden, what gets avoided, and what never enters the experience script at all. Have you noticed how the same corridor can feel like 1912 and at the same time be completely different underneath? That ambiguity is the heart of the project, and it is why it fascinates so many people. The fact is that the conflict is not just opinion. It shows up in the design, in the restrictions, and in the language. And here is the rhetorical question that always hits hard. If memory makes people uncomfortable, does that mean it is being disrespected, or does it mean it is being remembered the right way? When the tension rises, the next fact becomes technical. Separating aesthetics from safety without breaking the illusion, it is a tough balance. Wood and brass in front, redundancy and code compliance behind it. And that is not just to satisfy regulations, it is to keep the ship from becoming an argument against itself. Because if the proposal is a historical experience, it has to be convincing, but it also has to be defensible in real operation. The interesting part is that many controversial decisions are not yes or no. They are, how do we hide it without lying? And that how defines the final quality of the project. That is where small integration solutions turn into major internal debates. Not every early idea survives. Some are cut because of cost, others because of regulations, and some are cut because they would simply land badly with the public. This almost never becomes a headline, but this is where the project really changes. The public sees the final version and assumes it was always like that, but it was not. There are versions, attempts, pullbacks, and quiet cuts. The fact is that what disappears is often exactly what would create the strongest direct comparison to 1912. So the project chooses a cleaner path, more controlled, less provocative, even if that frustrates people who wanted a total replica. That tension between expectation and viability runs through everything. And speaking of quiet adjustments, some things get reformulated with no announcement, no statement, no noise. You only notice if you compare versions, if you catch what moved, what became neutral, what stopped being highlighted. That happens because this project is not just construction. It is risk management, technical and symbolic. The fact here is that silence is often a strategy to keep the discussion from spinning out of control. And that brings in the uncomfortable question. When a detail disappears without explanation, is it for safety or because they fear the reaction? Most of the time, the answer is a mix of both. Another essential fact. A serious project does not try to recreate the tragedy. It tends to avoid staging because then it becomes something else entirely, and no responsible team wants that. Instead, you see gestures of respect, curation, restrictions, careful language, and careful choices about what is offered as experience. Even the way certain areas are isolated says a lot. The interesting part is that when this care is done well, it almost disappears, and that is the goal. This is not about shock, it is about context. And that posture directly shapes the next point, how to operate without feeding sensationalism. When we talk about route and operation, the logic stays the same. Avoid direct association with the original sinking. That is not dodging the subject. It is cutting off the path to sensationalism. The project tries to exist as a contemporary ship with historical aesthetics, not as a reenactment. The fact is that this care shows up in small decisions, itinerary, communication, even how certain images are framed. And in the end, that is what separates legitimate curiosity from empty controversy. Some subjects cannot be handled in easy click mode. If the project wants to be taken seriously, it has to act like something serious. Before it even sails, a project like this already enters modern maritime history as a case study. Not just because of size, but because of the mix of engineering, regulation, and public image. It is almost like the ship exists in two layers: the physical layer, steel, cables, routines, and the symbolic layer, memory, debate, identity. The fact is that the symbolic layer can be just as heavy as the structure because it defines how the public interprets everything. And the more you look, the more you realize it. The impact starts long before the ocean. In a project like this, construction is already part of the message, and the message is already public debate. The final fact is the most important one. The biggest impact may not be in the ocean at all, but in the debate this name creates. Some people see historical education, others see an ethical boundary being tested. And the interesting part is that both sides can point to real arguments. Have you ever seen a topic that looks technical turn into a moral debate that fast? This is one of those. The uncomfortable question is this: if the project makes people discuss history seriously, is that a strength, or is it a problem created on purpose? Maybe it is both, and that is exactly why it keeps pulling people in. The Titanic of 1912 marked the world because of what happened. Titanic 2027 leaves a mark because of what it represents, an attempt to turn a massive memory into a controlled experience. And that makes comparison inevitable, even when it is not fair, because the public compares with emotion, not only with technical knowledge. But comparison is not repetition. Comparison is understanding what changed at sea, in the law, and in safety culture. The fact is that by trying to look like the past, the project ends up teaching just how different the present really is. And there is another detail. The project's very existence pulls in questions you never see in promotional material, like, what is the limit of what is acceptable when history includes victims? In the end, this ship does not sail only on water, it sails through public opinion. When you see wood, brass, and warm light, it feels like the past. But behind that image, there is a modern logic you cannot see in the photo. Redundancy, compartmentation, flow control, inspections, sensors, protocols. That does not ruin the experience. It explains why a ship with old world aesthetics can exist today without being irresponsible. The fact is that when this difference is handled well, it barely draws attention, and that is exactly why it works. But it comes at a cost. A lot has to be redesigned without the public noticing, and that demands very specific internal architecture choices. And here is a point most people overlook. The project is not just imitating a ship. It is translating an era into a modern operational standard. Maybe that is where the real value is, showing why 1912 cannot be copied but can be explained more clearly than ever. In the end, what divides people is the central question. Does the name honor or provoke? And it is easy to understand why that bothers people, because collective memory is not just information. It is respect, boundaries, and responsibility. At the same time, hiding the subject does not erase history, and ignoring it teaches nothing. The fact is that the project becomes a mirror. It reveals what each person expects when they hear Titanic. Some expect tribute, others expect restraint, others expect controversy from the start. And here comes the rhetorical question that always returns. If a project makes you discuss history more seriously, is that a positive effect, even if it was born from a brand? Depending on how it is handled, yes. Depending on how it is sold, it can become nothing but noise. Now notice the contrast. Everything looks calm, clean, controlled, and even so, the name carries weight. The scale of the ship is impressive, but what stays with you is the feeling that every decision had to be justified twice, once by engineering and once by public perception. That is why the project direction usually avoids excess and avoids anything that gets too close to tragedy reenactment. The fact here is that breathing room is also a decision. Show the ship from the outside. Let the ocean appear. Remind people this is a real environment and a dangerous one, not a set. And when the aesthetics are classical, that contrast hits even harder. On the outside, the past. Behind it, the present. That puts the topic back where it belongs. Operation, care, and memory. This is not about repeating disaster. It is about treating history with limits. Maybe some stories do not need to be repeated, they need to be understood. And understanding here means looking at what changed. Technology, rules, culture, and public expectation. The fact is that a ship with this name can only exist today because the world learned, often the hard way, what cannot be done at sea. So instead of a perfect replica, what you get is a choice. Look historical, operate modern, and carry the debate that comes with it. And honestly, that is what gives this subject its soul. It is not just a beautiful design. It is a test of how we handle collective memory in a commercial format. And if you feel like this discussion has no easy answer, that is okay, because real history rarely does. At the end of the day, Titanic 2027 exists as much in memory as it does in steel. It is a physical project, but it is also a public conversation about history, respect, and limits. The fact is that it does not need to sink to make an impact. It only needs to exist to make the world debate. And this is not just a like it or hate it conversation. It touches ethics, historical education, safety, marketing, and cultural responsibility. The project tries to stand on all of those fronts at the same time, and that explains why it fascinates people and makes people uncomfortable. So I will close with the question that ties everything together. Do you think this project honors the past or touches something that should remain untouched? And more importantly, what would be the most responsible way to tell this story today?
This was an AI reconstruction inspired by records from the time. The narrative used dramatization to bring the events to life.